Okay, after the last presentation and with the questions we had, I thought it'd be best to probably bring in some professionals that have done pollinator gardens throughout the area. Tonight I've got Jody Dahmer and Maria Corsi. They're definitely passionate about pollinator gardens. They're here on their own accord. They volunteered to come over here and do a presentation. Jody and Mariah they work for Beargrass Thunder Landscaping. They've been doing it since 2002. They've been very instrumental in preparing ordinances for Louisville, J-Town, and just recently Jeffersonville. So I'm not going to take a lot of time with my introduction. I'm going to go ahead and get them up here right now. This is Jody and Mariah, and I'm going to let them tell you all about pollinator gardens.
Thank you.
Who's got that?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So this presentation, we do a lot of circuit tours around the soil and water conservation districts. Specifically to this ordinance, we're going to go into just glancing details through the presentation, but there is a written ordinance that was in most cities before 1930 called the Uniform Standards Code that basically meant that when suburban development was happening on former farmland, what is a way to distinguish a house built on a cornfield from a farmhouse? And a lot of times that was to restrict what could be grown on someone's property. And so because it's in writing, as anything over a certain height is usually classified as a weed. With the garden movement happening after 2020, we found that a lot of our clients were getting cited from laws from the 1930s on what they could grow legally on their land. So when we're trying to change some of these things, bear with us, but when we talk about weeds and code enforcement, a lot of times weeds have to do with agricultural policy. When you are growing kudzu on your land, eventually it becomes your neighbor's land and eventually the city as a whole because those seeds are so easy to spread.
And even though that's where the idea of where a weed came from, we use the word weed pretty often in the yard. Like there's weeds among the grass. And some that leads to confusion what is an actual weed. I think a lot of us are familiar with the monarch butterflies. They feed off of a variety of plant called milkweed. And we have even had problems where if it has weed in the name, does that mean it's a weed? And so as our culture has kind of progressed with weeds, that's kind of created some obfuscation between the original intent of what it was.
So definitions, especially in city codes, are important, and I'm not going to list off everything here, but when it comes to what a prairie is, what a flower garden is, a lot of times what we've seen is people like to landscape with whatever is available, and most of those times they cannot tolerate the hot summers here on the Ohio River Basin. I'm sure that many of you had some boxwoods in that last freeze 2 years ago that got pretty crispy. And especially when you're doing city money to do landscaping, it's becoming more and more important to have flowers, to have trees, to have shrubs that specifically not only originate in Indiana, but also can come from the Ohio River Basin itself to try to be able to find seeds, to find local sources that can actually tolerate higher temperatures in the basin here.
Yeah, and in the benefits to it ecologically are untold. You know, you're helping a monarch population, you're helping the bees, you're helping all kind of other pollinators, which stretch to bugs that most of us have never even heard of. So not only does it benefit the ecology, it can benefit what the bottom line is as well.
And just to front run some of these things, we are not saying you do not have to mow your grass to become a pollinator habitat. That is something that we are not in favor of. The fescue lawns that most people have, they are very easy to outcompete everything around it. And so eventually, if you don't cut it, you get this grass area looking there. And there's a bunch of native grasses that are able to be mixed into flowers. Quail habitat, for instance, they use certain types of grasses for that. But fescue is not anything that we want or want to support.
And by and large, most fescues are invasive that we actually put in, so they're non-native. They're made to kind of either kind of struggle so that you have to put a lot of money into your lawn, or to thrive. And when something thrives beyond what our ecological capacity can take, it does smother our native plants, which is what takes it into an invasive area.
And so for all of the codes that we help with, especially with cities, we really like to make sure that we put in an addendum that say, this does not include unmanaged turf grass. You can still get cited if you are having an unkept lawn and you're just trying to be lazy.
A lot of people want to put in pollinator gardens for all the reasons we said before, but also because it's lower maintenance. But the important caveat is that it's lower maintenance. You may not be out there mowing every 2 weeks, but you definitely have maintenance that you need to do on your lawn regularly.
And so just to go over again, in the 1930s, a lot of times the cities adopted a standard code. It replaced farmland. There is, with suburbs, there was a clear merge into, what used to be a rural area. And so a lot of times these codes were adopted without ever thinking that that farm area was ever going to actually be agriculturally productive again. So, most people thought that when they put a subdivision on a piece of land, even though that soil was probably pretty good farmland, that you would only mow grass for the entire lifetime that you own the property. And that, is starting to become questioned. For Indiana, these were some of the legacy ordinances. City of Jeffersonville did just change their ordinance last week. So this was their original. And I just highlighted, it was very vague a lot of times. So a lot of times it says, anything over 10 inches. It is unlawful for the owner of any lot to be overgrown with weeds, grass, or rank vegetation. And when you talk about code enforcement, if somebody is not from an agricultural background, you are leaning on the individual to potentially fine or cite somebody for something that they might not have any idea is a flower, isn't a flower. And unless there are standardized processes, it's really easy to get lost in the mix, especially if somebody just really thinks your garden's ugly, even if it could be feeding your family. So again, this is just Jeffersonville's and the newest ordinance. I don't know if any of you have a copy, but it definitely changes a lot of things, and we'll go over those changes at the very end of the presentation. The code enforcement issues. Really, it's more of what I'm talking about with if your neighbor currently thinks your property is ugly or messy for any reason, they have the ability to, of course, call. But as the city expands into farmland, where does the culture shift between what is acceptable for farming and what is acceptable for a suburb, unless there is some distinction in there? And one of the things that we ran into with Louisville, a sunflower, before it bloomed, was classified as a 6-foot weed if you had the wrong officer come to your house. And then after the petals fell off and before it was able to be harvested as sunflower seed, once those petals fell off, it was all reclassified as a 6-foot weed until those sunflowers came in. So it put the homeowner, if you're growing taller crops, at a serious risk of looking messy or unkempt in the city of Louisville. And especially if your neighbor, in Louisville, there's a lot of competitive pressure for land and land speculation. A lot of times the people would actually call multiple times to try to put liens on properties that they wanted to acquire from the land bank.
And so as we shift into a different kind of, everyone's standard of beauty is going to be different. And a lot of people find pollinator patches or meadows extremely beautiful, while others can find it messy. So it's moving from what is a grass and manicured landscape culture to find those other cues that would indicate that it's being taken care of. Buffers, small fencings, labeling is also very important. Yeah, stuff like this is super helpful. You can tell that it's been purposefully mulched. We have a sign that marks that it is trying to be created for a pollinator patch. A small low-rise fence that indicates the outside of the actual pollinator patch. And then a buffer that's set back from the actual right-of-way of the property. And all of these things, while we aren't trained to immediately see them as like manicured lawn, ultimately this is a manicured lawn and did take a ton of time to do.
And you can see the existing grass in front of that fence. That is what the neighbors started with because it was so shaded the grass actually couldn't grow. And so this was substantial erosion that we helped fix with a fence, just a small picket fence, and then keeping everything within sight lines and making sure that there was a distinct border and buffer.
And just in our business, we offer over 288 different plants. And that is not every native plant that is in existence, but with that large variety, we can mitigate water conditions. We can find things that grow where grass doesn't. We can find things that are better committed to the humidity and changing temperatures of Kentucky. And so it really does expand people's options beyond grass as well.
So this is the revised code that we helped start in Louisville in 2022. This was the first change to the property maintenance code in this region. And that is amending the weeds code to include managed natural landscapes. We call them yardens, but that's just a nice pun. But managed natural landscapes, what we want is a clearly defined rule so that people that want to grow flowers on the property they own, or for instance, putting a meadow in a public park, is protected and expected as to what the process is. Because when you first start something with seeds, sometimes you have to explain to people how plants work. The seeds will take some time to grow into flowers and bloom, but especially if they're annual plants, you will have blooms within about 2 to 3 months, and that area will no longer need tax money to mow. And putting those distinctions, especially the cost-saving measures in formerly mowed areas, it protects the stream banks, it protects a lot of things from erosion, but more importantly, you don't have worker crews going out in July heat trying to mow a slope at a 45-degree angle. There's a lot of benefits specifically to taxes as well. And most importantly, we make sure that turf grass and noxious weeds are still, of course, not allowed. Nobody wants kudzu.
And when we were developing the code, we really focused on planting with attention. This isn't just letting everything grow up until something good's finally there. It's about removing invasives or non-natives and then putting in pollinator appropriate things. So the idea is that even if you have a meadowscape, you should be able to ID almost all of the plants within there.
And maintenance, especially, I'm sure that you've seen I-65 and the pear spots that are popping up. There does have to be at least annual maintenance with a meadow. Otherwise, with birds and things like that, a meadow will always turn to forest. That's just the way that nature works. And being on top of that, that's something that can be worked into existing maintenance guidelines, using existing mower teams, using existing equipment. It's just changing the rules a little bit to make sure that there's standard copies in place so that people can get trained. Because, pear trees, they spread like wildfire. We don't want any more of them than we have to deal with. And having those regulations and having those rules in place, eventually each meadow that you have in Clarksville could be harvested for more seed. You could be self-sufficient just with the seeds you have in the city limits. You wouldn't have to import from anywhere, and they would all be heat specific.
Because of the revised code, we were actually able to get a contract with the Parks Alliance in Louisville. We did a 15,000 square foot meadow. We planted 21 million seeds, or it was 2.5 million seeds, individual seeds. I split into 2 different seed mixes, and we've planted over 400 rooted plugs as well. We do quarterly maintenance on it, which we remove small trees and the invasives that are kind of expected in year 1. And we're actually running classes as well to teach some of the youth on how to do this. And like Jody mentioned, just here in November, we're going to do a seed harvesting event, and the Parks Alliance is going to be able to use those seeds in another meadow in another park.
Now, there were some problems. I talked about the benefits, but with Louisville being the pioneer, so to speak, in this space, we did run into a few things with code enforcement specific to signage and what is considered a food crop. Because people that were growing food to bake, say flour, wheat, millet, rye, the same stuff we put in whiskey, That's in the grass family, and unfortunately for the first couple of years, code enforcement had a lot of problems identifying what was rye, what was supposed to be used for flower, and what if it was just a fescue lawn that was growing up unobtained. So for the first 2 years, we couldn't have any baking in the city limits because people thought that it was illegal. So that is still a discussion that we're having, but a lot of times what we do is just have a little food sign, just making sure that people know that, you know, corn, wheat, it's not just somebody's lawn that turned into 6-foot corn stalk. This is one of the signs that the Jefferson County Soil and Water Conservation District gives for free while supplies last. There's usually about 50 to 100 signs a year. This is our business. We just have the exact same wording, but we have all of the rules for code enforcement, easy to identify and read on the back. If code enforcement does service that yard, they literally have a checklist that can go through. So we're not leaving anything up to chance. We want to make sure people can grow what they want on the land they have, but it also has to have something to show that it's intentional, planning with a purpose. These are some other signs that people and other cities, Minnesota's a leader in this space, have for you know, just different bee-friendly gardens, wildflower plantings. As long as it's legible, it's usually okay. And here's just some examples of the work that we've done. This on the left is a clover lawn with a what we call a pollinator patch. It's just a demarcated section with a low-rise fence, and in that section it's mulched, rooted plants. That got about 4 to 5 foot tall, but it was in an identifiable square with walkways all of the way around it and signage. On the right, this actually was one of the worst legal dumping spots in the city of Louisville behind Oak Street. What we did, we worked with U of L on a study where we went to every property adjacent to the alley and we asked them if we could plant a meadow. Every place that we put flowers had no illegal dumping during the entire year that happened. We solved something that Metro couldn't solve in 10 years with about $200 worth of flower seeds. The recommended changes I would recommend for anyone wanting to pursue this is to always look at what the city could use as an example to show others. You know, even if it's an area of park space that doesn't have a lot of good soil, the grass looks pretty sparse. Even if it's a 9x9 square, that shows, especially, you know, people that are on the fence about it, what is and isn't aesthetically acceptable at the moment. And especially for milkweed, it's really easy to scale, even if it's a small section. A free seed giveaway in October, that always gets people. But especially if you have, you know, an example piece, it's much easier to copy than having just a free-for-all and people wanting to, you know, just kind of experiment. These are just some example gardens that are legal now. So this is an easement. This is a drainage ditch that is no longer mowed on the left. In the center, that's a rain garden. This used to be an area of standing water, and it's now been landscaped with root plants that, you know, some grasses go 6 to 10 feet down. And then on the right, this is actually a parking lot. And that's a drainage area in the middle of a parking lot, and, you know, it looks pretty. And it's not harming anybody trying to park. You have a nice little vegetation area there. The bees, butterflies are able to use it. But most importantly, you know, it's not impeding anything flow of traffic. So getting established, most important thing, especially getting started, is to remove the grass. And you can chemically treat it. You could do a prescribed burn. You could sod cut. Really, it's just a matter of the labor and the equipment you have. A lot of farm equipment can be repurposed into meadows very simply and easily, and it's a really nice partnership with the Conservation District to try to find a farmer contractor that might be able to make a little extra money. Plant establishment takes about 3 years total. The first year, it's focused on root production. Second year, you see more vegetative growth as it outcompetes the grass. Third year is almost little to no maintenance. The plants have already been established. Even irrigation is almost no longer needed in the projects that we've done.
And when it comes to making these changes too, it's usually year one that you see the neighbors and everything kind of notice. There'll be if people are going to complain, there's a small rush of complaining when the seeds start going up or when new plants start going in, because like, hey, that's different. And there's a little bit of usually grass to mitigate. And then that first winter where things finally fall back. And a lot of pollinator gardens, you like to keep the overwinter stems for the birds that come through to eat, and it also actually creates habitats for our pollinators to actually lay eggs and then hatch again. So that's when you move from just being a pollinator feeding station to actually creating pollinator habitat that actually helps and keeps the ecology going to the next level. But when it's one single neighbor in a neighborhood that'll make this change, those are usually the two places you'll get complaints about. A little bit of education, that sign going out explaining that these are here for the birds, and usually all complaints go away by year 2 and 3 when you're getting a really nice established garden.
Just for example, in Louisville, we had about 100 code enforcement complaints the first year as like code enforcement reached out to ask about clarification. This year, we've had 2. So it really is just educating code enforcement. A lot of times, they've been on the job for decades, and this is a very new concept. They have a very hard job. And so Mariah was actually able to present to code enforcement in the spring, and that I really think helped mitigate a lot of those issues. These are just seasonal gardens from the initial planting to approximately 2.5 years later. You can see the top left is when it was first started, going through the seasons, and then that next big flush. And you can see how much more square footage just a few plants took up. Imagine, if you do a mowing audit and see which areas might not need to be mowed anymore, it scales very, very quickly. This is just an example garden with a pathway through it. So these are all native plants to Indiana. And there are some different heights, of course. You have native plants that can tolerate, 2 feet in heavy shade. You have plants that grow 5 to 10 feet in some places in full sun. And it's really nice to have some diversity in there and also make paths so that the public can use it. Any area could be like the Parklands, could be like Origin Park. And especially when it comes to seed harvesting, every flower that you see here could be thousands of seeds. So when you're talking about putting something in the ground, it's that self-sufficiency. Eventually, if you have a large enough meadow space and a place to store the seeds safely, Clarksville could be literally self-sufficient when it comes to making more of these heat-resistant landscaping. This is another seasonal from spring to summer to winter. Now winter, it's very interesting because for most of us, we think that winter, everything should be cleared. This is the one spot in the entire subdivision that birds actually can migrate to and eat in the fall and winter. Cardinals especially do not really leave their area. And, this homeowner specifically was able to see birds that formerly they had no idea even lived in the neighborhood because this was the only food source. And then when we're talking about determining compliance, code enforcement obviously needs to keep on doing their job. We are not saying that because this ordinance passes, everybody's yard is going to look like a jungle. We need to have standards, but most importantly, we need to make sure that code enforcement isn't arbitrarily fining somebody for growing food specifically. Something like having ID apps, planting with a purpose, being able to tell people that, do you know what you planted? And if they have a list, great. If they have a sign, even better. But it's really important that we hit home that we are not just wanting just wild places.
And I think it's important to note that our business is a native plant landscaping business, but the way that these ordinances are written really just opens up options of all kinds, even if it's not necessarily native. There are stuff in landscaping stores here, Lowe's, Home Depot, everything that you can kind of go and do. If you want to do English tea garden, as long as it isn't these few things that are on the actual noxious list here, really you can plant anything in your yard. It is your land and you can grow food, you can plant the plants. We're gonna always like go native, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons to do this is for the pollinators, but there's gonna be other people that it's gonna open up other options for as well.
And when it comes to being able to plant native plants and stuff endemic to the region, it also helps really combat the amount of invasive plants, especially along creek banks. Japanese knotweed, it's one of the largest invasives that we have in the Louisville Park system, and it's spread to almost every creek bank around here. Johnson grass. There are some native plants that can actually replace that. Multiflora rose, that's a really invasive ornamental that spreads into forests. We could plant a native blackberry, a native rose, and those seeds will help to outcompete the invasives as long as it reaches critical mass. It's an easy way to link invasive removal with native planting. Just invasive removal alone, it mitigates the problem, but it does not help the problem. If you see honeysuckle, those giant bush honeysuckle things on a creek bank, you need to do something to not only remove it, but treat the stumps and plant an elderberry bush, plant some blackberries, do something that can hold that soil in even when you remove those plants, because just removing is not going to do much to increase the health of the stream. One of the things I do want to mention, before the weeds ordinance, a lot of times people were getting cited for having poison hemlock on their property. It was actually carrots. I do want to mention that there are some plants that are edible that unless you have a little bit of training, they do look like noxious weeds. But that's really important to, again, planting with a purpose, go up to something, hey, listen, are you growing fennel in that raised bed? Okay, great. That way you're not just citing them from your car, and you're able to have more of a connection. So last but not least, I know that this is the last presentation. I really thank y'all for your time. These are the suggestions that I have for any city wanting to go forward, more about native plants and growing that relationship, pun completely intended. Having trainings with code enforcement. And specifically, if you have an example garden and you're able to do a video with code enforcement saying, hey, listen, this is a native plant. This is what this garden could look like. We're making the journey with you. It does a lot to increase the, acceptance, but also it creates an example for other people to use.
I just did a brand new video with one of our Metro Council people, and he totally admitted to me during the video that when he voted for our ordinance, he thought of it just being mostly applied to the city and not so much to the suburbs. But it has gone the whole way out. It applies to all of Jefferson County. And this lovely woman redid her entire front yard in a dry creek bed. And it is absolutely gorgeous. So we got to record in front of her house, and she got to talk about that process. And she's outside taking care of that front yard a whole lot. She's just not outside pushing a mower.
And, being able to have signage, especially if it's funded signage, to make sure there's no issues, that would be great. But otherwise, having resources to make sure that citizens can actually get signage, that's critically important to make sure that there's no disconnect or no miscommunication there. Because code enforcement has a job to do. Neighbors have every right to complain, about, rank vegetation, tall grass. But as long as we have something in writing, it makes things so much easier to manage. And having an exemption, as long as you know what you're planting on your own property, you shouldn't be fined for feeding your family or growing plants that are not noxious weeds.
Yeah, they feed our earth.
And so with that, I'm open to questions. I know that we talked a lot, and I really do thank you for your time.
I do have one question, because I actually have 3 raised beds in my yard. I know Darcy has raised beds too. Do you all do, or how do you help with like soil samples to make sure what grows best where?
Sure, totally. So when we do native plants, we come out and just do like sunlight, the moistness, stuff like that. When it comes to planting in earth, we do help do soil testing through our Soil and Water Conservation District, but by and large, within the client base that we work with, there's a lot of lead in our soil, so we do raised beds only. It just became into play, especially into Louisville, because a lot of people only got sun in their front yard and their back was completely shaded. So that's where it kind of came into play, whether or not it was even okay to have a garden bed in the front, and this was able to make it. So a lot of the vegetables in it of themselves aren't usually being grown in the ground. They're being grown in raised beds. And if they're being grown in the ground, like sunflowers, they're usually being used for the soil remediation to remove the lead, because sunflowers will actually accumulate that lead up and out of the soil.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that. So, I mean, education is key.
Yeah.
I think for anybody, especially our residents.
For you, if you want to do a soil test, I don't know if you all do it, but Fresh Start in Louisville, if you just take like a cup of your soil, I love them. They're awesome. I go to them for
a lot, too.
everything.
Highly recommend
I know,
Fresh
yeah.
Start, yeah.
Yeah, they're awesome. He's great. He's very knowledgeable. He's an amazing person too. You can sit there for hours just talking to the guy.
Yeah.
My question for you is, because like her, I have about 13 raised beds, and I have a tea garden, I have an herb garden, I've got everything in my backyard.
Cool.
It looks really neat. But then I also have a neighbor who's probably about six houses down. They do have a lot of invasive plants, because I will go out into my yard and I will, by the end of the summer, like their plants are growing in mine. And so I guess my question for you all is when that happens, typically, how is that handled in Louisville area or the other towns that take this ordinance on?
Totally. So as of right now, it would be, I think it's still all just reporter-based right now. So you'd be calling 811 and calling your metro. And so it would be on, in our situation, to report that property for harboring many invasives. Unfortunately, our list of invasives for Louisville is pretty short right now. These are all based off of farming noxious weeds, so they kind of came straight off of that. We are actually, luckily, because we did this 2 years ago, Councilman Ja'Cory Arthur's working with us to talk about what it means to have something that is so invasive that it is invading neighbors' properties, such as like invasive bamboo and stuff like that. So as of right now, mostly just self-reporting and mitigation, but we're working on new ordinances to kind of address invasives as well.
And I will say that Indiana, y'all's state laws on invasive weeds is incredible and very, very strict and defined. I think that honestly, if you do have, record that your neighbor is harboring invasive plants and you have documentation of this, I would really suggest potentially talking to your state rep.
Yeah, you
because-
can't miss this house.
Yeah.
You can't miss it. Good.
May I, Mr. President? We've talked about maybe eventually having at least a part-time grants writer on town staff, and I'm curious, for things like kudzu that are really, I mean, I'm seeing it grow in my neighborhood where it's never been. Are there USDA grants or Indiana grants you're aware of for removal of that to that effect? Because it is, we're talking, I removed some this week. It's a job.
Yeah, kudzu especially is very, very hard. I'm not sure about Indiana-based grants. I do know that the USDA does have money from the last farm bill that was passed, and unfortunately, I don't know if this year's farm bill is getting patched, but there is money that is into conservation agriculturally. But I do think as of right now, it is tied to having a Schedule F in your name. So I'd be really interested, maybe if the Army Corps or anything has information on something like that.
It's a great idea. Yeah.
And the other big piece that we're working on specifically with the Department of Transportation, the reason that we have so many pear trees on the I-65 right-of-ways and 265 right-of-ways is because the timeline for invasive removal on the federal level and sometimes the state level is not the same as the local level. And so what we're doing in Louisville is actually having a sit down with KYTC, with Metro government and the new Department of Transportation group that's forming on trying to actually streamline that, because I-64 running through Cherokee Park, unless it's done at the same time, all that honeysuckle just moves places and it doesn't actually help any of the residents on either side. So, getting those seeds under control, but most importantly, having the funding to put new seeds down and new rooted plants in its place really goes a long way to help combat the invasiveness.
That's probably the biggest thing I see. A lot of people get money to remove the plants, but there needs to be a tandem amount of money, at least to put seeds and/or native things back in, because otherwise the seed bank that is in the soil will just resprout all of those plants.
And when in doubt, goats. Goats are the
Goats
best
are
thing.
very good.
Goats are the best thing for kudzu. I swear by it, and honestly, the goat farmers can get a little kickback too. So that's there's a trial run for goat grazing in Iroquois Park right now on the hillside.
Yeah.
And so the goat farmers get a kickback, the mowing team doesn't have to be out in the heat, and the goats get fed.
Yeah.
We were just talking about goats.
Have you all seen any statistics or studies done on the difference between these type of gardens compared to like green space when it comes to like heat islands and dealing with extreme heat? Because I know we had a study done. We have our own little heat island with all our retail. So this much better than grassy areas and trees and
Yes, absolutely. So when it comes to soil health in general, like planting this way increases, so most people, you've had grass since at least the 30s in whatever space you're living in, and you've been mowing. So if you stick your hand into the dirt, your soil's gonna be like a hard layer of clay for the most part around here. In just 6 years, you're gonna start seeing like extra debris on the top. And within 10 to 15 years, you're actually recreating like a forest floor. And because that breaks up the soil so significantly, you start to get increased water going down into it. And it does help to dramatically decrease the heat island effect. We've worked a lot with Louisville Grows in Louisville, because they're as a nonprofit, their main focus is combating the urban heat island. Tree canopy is a huge deal in reducing that, so also making people feel more comfortable to put in all the layers in their homes, which is tree, shrub, flower, shorter flower, vine, and then ground cover. It just significantly decreases the heat and makes a huge difference.
just speaking to AD's point, because I know there's lots of funding in Indiana to combat heat. I know we lost our heat person before we could get to that, but it's extra money that's out there.
I know that trees are usually a big thing that they love to
Yeah.
put that towards, at very least.
I have a couple questions. Most of your pictures online on the screen were pollinator gardens in front yards. Clarksville's ordinance, or proposed ordinance, eliminates those.
Okay.
Is that same in other areas, or is that just, does Louisville have that ordinance?
In Louisville's ordinance, your property is your property, and there's not a distinction between a front and back side. What J-Town has done and what Jeffersonville has done is a percentage of the front area, specifically right-of-way. An area by a right-of-way has to have a setback of 5 feet with a border.
Yeah, so we did borders in ours, and in Jeffersonville, the one line I'll read out loud here, it says landscape may not exceed 50% of the portion of the lot facing a public right-of-way, such as a front yard of residence. Personally, I think that is a really bad idea. It is your front yard. There's a whole host of species. Your front yard is going to be different sun, soil, and just conditions. And I do think that when you get into percentages, you're asking for there to be surveys. What is exactly 50% of my land? What does that 50% of my land have to be if it's not a pollinator garden? Does it have to be grass, or are you allowing other ground covers and whatnot? So I think, on our personal opinion, the buffer, I think, solves most of those issues. You want to make sure that nothing's ever following into the right-of-way of public spaces. You want to make sure it's defined. And then that buffer also applies to your neighbors as well. That way, if your neighbor aren't participating, you have to respect their property line as well. That way there isn't a huge drift over there. But doing percentages opens up, I think, a whole host of problems, and you have to ask what that other 50% you're mandating people to have then.
If you did do it that way, where you couldn't have stuff in your front yard, pollinator gardens, does a flower like a tulip count as a pollinator?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's a problem they're going to run into later, because technically a tulip is a non-native, but I think a bee would use it.
could be a bad choice of flower.
Yeah, I think,
on my part.
no. I think that your question
Non-native.
exemplifies the problem very well, because while we all probably agree that tulip's really pretty, a flower that I may think is gorgeous may not be something that you think is gorgeous, and how many flowers in a space qualifies it to be a pollinator garden? By creating this issue where you're demanding have to be one thing and have to be another, you are requiring the extra definition down to the point of which flowers count as pollinators and what actually constitutes a pollinator space.
Keeping it a little bit more vague, especially as it results to the right-of-way, what we found is it encourages people to, one, have a demarcated boundary, but also it allows them to actually like talk to their neighbors about what they want to do instead of growing wild, because they know that they're kind of, the neighbors, if it gets too rowdy, they are going to still call, you know, and it helps to build that community and that trust a little bit, especially in the beginning. I always recommend starting small, and you can always expand that footprint, but you got to make sure that if you're trying to, you know, change the course of a river, you can't just build a dam, right? You know, you have to really, you know, strategize and make sure that it works. And, you know, to Mariah's point, adding more red tape to that and adding lists of approved plants, it really causes people to have more animosity than necessary, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, when you do have a percentage as well, you do open up to the idea of like, perhaps like some people who do pollinators are so passionate that they may be willing to go and get a land survey. And I do think that at that point you are eating up a lot of time when back and forth over someone just wanting to do a pollinator space. So that's my personal recommendation, is to avoid percentages and to allow in the front yard with appropriate border signing and fencing.
Thank you.
So we just received a copy of the ordinance that Jeffersonville passed actually today. They were hesitant to give it to us because Mayor Moore hadn't signed it. I said, I'm not looking for it as an enforcement tool. I just want a copy so we can start learning more about what you've done. And so Rick now has that, and they do too. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be putting something together to pass out to you in draft form and then eventually bring back to you.
Y'all did fantastic. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for your
I love
patience.
Girls Vibe and everything about you too.
Appreciate y'all so much.
Thank you.